The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. No name, no return address, just a cream envelope with a slightly uneven fold and my street written in a handwriting that felt careful. Inside was a letter addressed to someone named Alice. I wasn't supposed to read it, but the paper smelled faintly of old ink and rain. And something about the way it began, "I still write to remember how it feels to care," made me forget that it wasn't meant for me. He wrote about small things, the way the light fell through his kitchen window. How he still set 2 cups of coffee on the table every morning out of habit. How silence could be louder than grief. There was no drama in his words, just this quiet honesty that felt more intimate than anything I'd heard in years. I folded the letter back, intending to return it. But my fingers hesitated on the paper. It had been so long since someone spoke in words that felt alive. So long since I'd read anything that wasn't an appointment reminder or a grocery list. That night, I left it on my bedside table. And when my husband asked what I was reading, I said, "Nothing. Just an old letter I found." He nodded, already distracted by the news on TV. The next morning, I reread the letter. Twice. And when I finally placed it back into its envelope, I realized my hands were trembling, not from guilt, but from something softer, almost forgotten, curiosity. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. Same handwriting. Same tone. And again, Alice. He wrote about the garden behind his house. How the roses bloomed late that year. How he kept writing even though no one answered anymore. And this time I didn't even pretend I'd send it back. I just sat there, reading a stranger's heart poured out on paper. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt seen. Even though the words weren't meant for me. That night, when my husband reached for me in bed, I kissed him softly. And wondered why I suddenly felt like I was lying. The third letter came with the smell of rain on paper. By then, I was already waiting for it, pretending I wasn't. It felt ridiculous, the way I'd start checking the mailbox before work. Hoping, and dreading, that his handwriting would appear again. This one was different. It began with, "I don't know why I keep writing, but I suppose it's easier than talking to ghosts." He spoke about how loneliness changes a person. How sometimes you just need someone to listen, even if they never answer. That line stayed with me for hours. I thought about answering. Not as Alice, but as someone who'd accidentally found her way into a stranger's silence. Someone who understood what it meant to miss being understood. I told myself it was harmless. A thank you, nothing more. A small kindness for a man who clearly needed to speak. That night, after my husband fell asleep beside me, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to comfort me. Now it only made me aware of how long it had been since anyone had asked me how I really was. I started simply. "I think your letters found me for a reason." I wrote about the smell of rain, about mornings that all looked the same. About the strange way words from a stranger could make me feel less invisible. When I signed it, I didn't use my name, just someone who reads. The next morning, I walked to the old post office in town. The clerk smiled when she took the envelope. And I almost laughed at how my hands were shaking again. It wasn't love. Not yet. But something in me had already shifted, quietly, dangerously. Because I wasn't just sending a letter. I was opening a door. That evening, when my husband came home, he asked why I looked distracted. "I just had a strange day," I said, smiling. He kissed my forehead, told me he'd missed me. And I smiled again. But part of me was still standing in that post office, watching my letter disappear through the slot. Knowing it was the first secret I'd sent into the world in years. His reply came faster than I expected, 4 days, maybe 5. By then I had almost convinced myself he wouldn't answer. That maybe my letter was too strange, too personal. Or that he'd finally stopped writing altogether. But when I saw the envelope, I knew immediately. Same careful handwriting. Same uneven fold. Only this time, it was addressed to me. He didn't call me by name, of course, he couldn't. But the first line read, "I never thought anyone would write back." He told me he'd been writing to Alice, his late wife, for nearly a year. That sending letters to their old address was the only way he knew how to speak to her. He said he didn't mean for them to find another reader. But somehow, knowing that they had, that someone had read them, felt like a small kind of mercy. I read his words slowly. Each one steady and heavy. Like the way people talk when they've carried silence for too long. He wrote about the garden again, about how winter was coming. And how he still left a chair empty at the breakfast table. He ended with, "If you ever write again, tell me something small. Something true. Something that still makes you feel alive." It was a strange request, simple, harmless. But I felt the weight of it in my chest. Because when was the last time I'd told anyone something true? That night, I sat in the same spot at the kitchen table. My pen hovering over the paper like it needed permission. I wrote. Sometimes I drive the long way home just to listen to one more song. And then, sometimes I wonder if I still know how to be loved. When I sealed the envelope, I realized I was smiling, softly, almost guiltily. It wasn't the thrill of danger yet. It was relief. The kind that comes when someone finally sees you. Even from far away. Later, when my husband came to bed, he asked if I'd locked the door downstairs. I said yes. But the truth was, a door inside me had already been left open. The letters became a rhythm. A quiet heartbeat beneath the noise of my everyday life. Every few days, one would appear, in the same delicate handwriting. Always sealed carefully, like he wanted the words to feel protected. At first, we wrote about simple things. Weather. Books. Coffee. He told me he'd started learning to bake because it made the house smell less empty. I told him that I watered plants I didn't even like. Just because I wanted something around me to keep growing. It was small talk dressed as honesty. But between the lines, there was something else. A warmth neither of us named. But both of us recognized. Soon, the letters grew longer. He began each one with "Dear you." And I answered as "Yours, the one who listens." And though we had never said our names, it started to feel like we already knew everything that mattered. I learned his handwriting the way people learn a voice. The loops of his Y's, the way his pen pressed harder. Whenever he wrote something he didn't want to admit. Sometimes, when I opened his letters, my fingers would shake like I was unwrapping a memory that wasn't mine. He wrote once. "There's something about writing to you that feels like breathing underwater, wrong, but necessary." I read that line 3 times. And for the first time, I didn't know if what I felt was comfort or danger. By then, my husband had stopped noticing the envelopes. He'd see me at the kitchen table, pen in hand, and think I was working on grocery lists or bills. I didn't correct him. I just kept writing. One morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was still, the light soft and gray. I made coffee, sat by the window, and wrote him about the sound of birds waking. About how silence feels different when it's shared. When I signed my name that day, I didn't hide behind someone anymore. I wrote my real name, just the first one, small and trembling. As if it could undo me. And when I sealed the envelope, I realized I was no longer waiting for his letters. I was living between them. His next letter felt heavier than the others. Thicker paper. Slower handwriting. The kind that comes from hesitation, or confession. When I unfolded it, the first thing I saw was my name. Not you, not the one who listens. My actual name, written carefully, like he was afraid to misspell something sacred. He wrote. "I told myself I wouldn't look you up, but I did. I know who you are now. I know where you live. I don't mean to frighten you, only to be honest. I just needed to see the face behind the letters. I read that paragraph 5 times before I could move on. My heartbeat had become the only sound in the room. He went on. You don't have to write back. But if you ever wanted to talk instead of write. There's a cafe near the post office, the one with the green awning. I go there on Fridays around noon. There was no pressure in his words. No plea. Just quiet sincerity, the same tone that had slowly built the bridge between us. I folded the letter shut. But my hands wouldn't stop trembling. It wasn't fear. It was recognition that we had already crossed every line except one. For days, I didn't answer. I left the letter on my nightstand, pretending I hadn't seen it. But every time I passed it, my pulse betrayed me. At night, my husband would talk beside me. About work, plans, small things. And I'd nod, smile, even laugh when I was supposed to. But somewhere deep inside, a small, reckless part of me was already sitting in that cafe. Watching the door, waiting for a man I'd never met but somehow already knew. By Friday morning, I couldn't pretend anymore. I told myself it would only be once. That I needed to see him. To make the wrongness real enough to let it go. I stood in front of the mirror before leaving. Tried to fix my hair, then gave up. No perfume. No lipstick. Just the smallest trace of hope that I'd be invisible, and still be seen. As I walked to the cafe, my chest felt tight. Like the air itself was testing me. Every step was a quiet betrayal. And yet, when I saw him, alone at a small table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, the world went quiet. He looked exactly like I'd imagined. And nothing like I expected. When our eyes met, I felt it, that same honesty his letters carried. Warm. Steady. Dangerous. And for the first time, I didn't want to be forgiven. I told myself I wouldn't see him again. That the one meeting was enough, a mistake I could fold neatly back into memory and hide between the pages of my routine. But the truth is, I'd already started counting days by his silence. The next Friday came, and I went back. No letter this time, no excuse, just a feeling that if I didn't go, something inside me would close forever. He was already there, sitting at the same table near the window. A cup of coffee in front of him, untouched, waiting, like he knew I'd come. When he saw me, his face softened, that small, uncertain smile I'd already learned to read in his handwriting. I didn't think you'd come back, he said quietly. Neither did I answered. And it was true. We didn't talk much at first. The words felt smaller in person, like they'd lost some of their courage outside the paper. But his voice, it carried the same warmth, the same rhythm. Every time he spoke, it felt like another letter being written between us, only this time in the air. At one point, he reached across the table. Not to hold my hand, just to brush away a stray thread on my sleeve. But his fingers lingered a second too long. And in that second, everything changed. It wasn't passion. It wasn't impulse. It was recognition, quiet, inevitable, heavy. The kind that makes you realize you've already fallen. And there's no graceful way to land. We walked outside after, into the soft light of late afternoon. The street was quiet, the air smelled faintly of rain. He asked if I wanted to walk a little, and I said yes. Even though I knew I shouldn't. We talked about nothing. The weather. Music. Coffee. But the silence between words said everything. When we stopped at the corner, he looked at me, really looked. As if he was memorizing the parts of me he'd only known through ink. I've thought about this, he said softly, and I know it's wrong. So do I whispered. And yet, neither of us moved. It just happened. The space between us closed. And his lips found mine, gently, as if asking for permission that neither of us could give. It was brief, trembling, too real. Not wild, not desperate, just honest. When he pulled away, I realized I was shaking. Not from guilt, but from the shock of how right it had felt. He stepped back, exhaled. "I'm sorry," he said. And I almost laughed, because I wasn't. Not yet. That night, when my husband kissed me goodnight, I closed my eyes and felt the wrong lips still on mine. And that's when I understood. You can't unfeel being seen. And once you've been seen, you can't go back to being invisible. I told myself the kiss had been a mistake, a moment carried too far by loneliness and the comfort of being understood. But every lie sounds softer when it's wrapped in truth. And the truth was simple: I wanted to see him again. Days passed in slow motion. I tried to stay busy, filling silence with noise, cleaning, working, pretending. But every night, my mind found its way back to that corner, to the feel of his breath just before he kissed me. It wasn't desire that haunted me. It was peace. That impossible peace of finally being known. The following Friday, I didn't wait for a letter. I went to him. Same cafe. Same time. Only this time, there was no hesitation, just the quiet certainty of what was already inevitable. He stood when he saw me. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. A mix of longing and restraint, like he was holding his breath between what was right and what was real. We didn't speak much. Our words had lost meaning somewhere between ink and skin. He asked if I wanted to take a walk. I nodded. It started to rain lightly, soft, scattered drops that blurred the world around us. We walked until we reached an old park behind the station, half empty, quiet. The kind of place where the world forgets to look. He turned to me. "Tell me not to," he said. And for a moment, I wanted to. But the word "don't" never left my lips. He stepped closer, brushed my hair behind my ear. And when he kissed me again, it was slower this time, certain, warm, almost kind. It didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like surrender. I didn't stop him when his hand slid to the back of my neck. Or when we found shelter beneath the trees. The rain pattering above us. The world shrinking to the sound of our breathing. Everything that followed was quiet, not hurried, not wild. Just two people lost in the kind of closeness that was never supposed to exist. Afterward, we didn't speak. He looked at me like someone who'd just seen the truth and wished he hadn't. I wanted to say something, anything. But every word I could think of felt too small for what we'd done. When we finally parted, there was no promise. Just a silence that said everything we didn't dare. That night, I went home soaked from the rain. My husband asked if I'd been caught in the storm. I said yes, and it wasn't a lie. Because storms don't always happen outside. Sometimes, they live under your skin. And the thunder is just your own heart refusing to be quiet. The days after felt like walking through fog. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. I went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, answering questions with half smiles. But my body was on autopilot. And my mind was still in that park, under the sound of rain, where I'd forgotten who I was supposed to be. He didn't write again. And neither did I. But I kept checking the mailbox anyway. Pretending it was just habit, not hope. At night, when my husband talked beside me, his voice sounded distant. Like coming through a wall. He asked if I was tired. I said yes. It was easier than explaining that the exhaustion came from pretending everything was fine. I'd lie awake after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, feeling that strange, silent ache in my chest. The kind that doesn't hurt enough to scream, but too much to forget. I thought I could go back to normal. But normal felt like pretending to be someone I'd already outgrown. Sometimes I'd drive past the cafe where we met, telling myself it was just coincidence. But slowing down anyway. Just in case. Once, I thought I saw him through the window. Reading, his coffee untouched. I didn't go in. I couldn't. Because if I saw him again, I knew I wouldn't stop at a conversation. And that terrified me more than guilt ever could. One evening, I found myself holding one of his old letters. Creased, soft at the edges. The ink slightly faded. I read the line I'd underlined months ago. Some people arrive in our lives only to remind us what still lives inside us. I closed my eyes. And whispered. I know. Because now I understood what he meant. He didn't just remind me what lived inside me. He woke it up. And once you've felt that, no amount of silence can make you forget the sound. The letter came 3 weeks later, no return address, just my name. For a moment I thought I was imagining it. I'd been trying so hard not to look for him. Not to need the sound of paper sliding through the slot. But there it was. And before I even opened it, I knew this one would hurt. His words were slower this time, careful, like every sentence had to pass through something heavy before it reached the page. He wrote. I told myself we were done. That silence was the kindest thing I could give you. But some nights, I still hear your voice in the rain. And I think maybe we left something unfinished. He said he was leaving town, for good this time. A small cottage by the sea, quiet, far away from the life that used to hurt. And then? I don't want to end this in a letter. If you can, meet me once more. Friday. Same cafe. I read that line over and over. Once more. It sounded so final that it almost felt safe. The next days blurred together. Everything I did, washing dishes, folding laundry, answering my husband's questions, felt like someone else's life. Because mine was already waiting for Friday. When the day came, I told my husband I had errands to run. He kissed my cheek and said, "Don't be long." I promised I wouldn't, and broke that promise the moment I stepped outside. He was there, of course. Same seat. Same green awning above the window. When he looked up and saw me, something in his eyes softened, relief, regret, and something like peace. We didn't order anything. Didn't need to. We just sat there, watching people walk by, pretending for a moment that the world didn't know who we were supposed to be. After a while, he said, I kept one of your letters. The one where you wrote that silence feels different when it's shared. I smiled. You still believe that? He nodded. More than ever. When we left the cafe, we walked without direction. Through narrow streets, into the edges of the city. Until we reached the park where the rain had found us once before. The air was still, heavy with memory. Neither of us spoke. He touched my hand, just lightly. And I didn't pull away. Then his fingers brushed my face. And I closed my eyes, because I already knew what would happen next. The kiss was slower this time. Not discovery, but farewell. And somewhere in that quiet, I felt everything we'd built collapse and bloom at the same time. When he finally let go, he whispered, "Now I can leave." I wanted to ask him not to. But all I said was, "Thank you." Because love, or whatever this was, isn't always meant to be kept. Sometimes it just passes through you. Like a letter that arrives by mistake. And changes everything before you can send it back. When I came home that evening, the house felt unfamiliar. Not different, just quieter, like it had been holding its breath while I was gone. The air smelled of dinner my husband had made. His jacket still hung over the chair by the door. And the TV murmured softly in the background. It was the same life I had left that morning. Only now, it felt like walking into someone else's memory. He looked up when I entered. "You're late," he said gently. "Traffic," I lied. He smiled, not suspecting a thing. He never did. I kissed his cheek. Out of habit, not love. And felt the faint trace of salt still on my lips. From tears or the sea breeze, I couldn't tell. He talked while I washed my hands. Something about work, about a friend buying a new car. His voice drifted through the hallway. And I tried to listen, I really did. but every word sounded distant. Like coming from a radio in another room. When he asked if I was okay, I said, just tired. And for the first time, the lie didn't hurt. Later that night, I stood by the window while he slept. The world outside was dark and still. The kind of silence that feels endless. And yet, I didn't feel lost anymore. Not peaceful, not whole. Just emptied. I touched the glass, cold against my skin, and thought of the way he'd looked at me before he said goodbye. That quiet understanding. That mercy. There was no anger. No promises. Just two people who'd found each other in the wrong lifetime. And let go before they could destroy the one they already had. I went to bed and lay beside my husband, watching his chest rise and fall. He stirred, turned toward me, his hand brushing mine in his sleep. For the first time in months, I didn't flinch. I didn't compare. I just let the moment be what it was. A truth dressed as peace. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered a silent prayer. Not for forgiveness, but for forgetfulness. Because some mistakes don't ruin you. They reveal you. And once revealed, you can never go back to being the person who didn't know. It arrived on a Monday morning. Plain envelope. No return address. Just my name, written in that same careful hand I thought I'd never see again. I stood in the kitchen, holding it for a long time before opening it. As if unsealing it would make everything real again. Would pull me back into something I'd already buried. Inside, just one page. His handwriting was slower this time, softer, as though he'd written it in a whisper. I thought leaving would silence the noise, it began. But silence only makes the truth louder. He wrote that the sea was colder than he remembered. But that the mornings were calm. The kind of calm that doesn't ask questions. He said he'd stopped writing to Alice. That her ghost had finally grown quiet. And then, one final paragraph. I keep your last letter by the window. The one where you said you'd drive the long way home just to hear one more song. I do that now too. It reminds me that some songs don't end, they just fade. No goodbye. No name. Just a single pressed wildflower. Tucked inside the fold, delicate, nearly weightless. Like everything we had been. I set the letter on the table and just stared at it. There was no rush of emotion, no heartbreak. Just stillness. Like the sound of rain long after it stopped. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I only whispered. Thank you. And meant it. Later that evening, I slipped the letter into the same box where I'd kept all the others. The one under the bed. Where secrets go to rest. And for the first time since it all began, I didn't wait for another envelope. Because I already had the ending. And it was quieter than I'd imagined. Sometimes I still think about him, not often, and not with longing. More like a song you once loved that now only drifts through memory. It doesn't hurt anymore. It just reminds you who you were when you first heard it. I never told anyone about what happened. Not my husband, not my friends, not even myself, not completely. Some truths don't need to be spoken to stay alive. They live quietly, between the things you don't say. I kept all the letters. Not because I want to read them again. But because throwing them away would feel like pretending it never happened. And I've learned, pretending is what brought me here in the first place. I used to think cheating meant crossing a physical line. That it was an action you could measure, name, condemn. But now I know. Sometimes, it's when you start saving your best words for someone else. When you look forward to a voice that isn't waiting at your table. When you let yourself be seen by someone who shouldn't know how to look at you that way. That's where it begins. And sometimes, that's enough to end everything. I'm not proud of what I did. But I'm not ashamed either. Because for a moment, I remembered what it felt like to be alive. To be noticed, to be wanted, to be human. And maybe that's what all of us are really searching for. Someone who looks at us and says, "I see you." And means it. My husband still doesn't know. He still kisses me goodnight. And I still kiss him back. But the woman who lies beside him now isn't the same one who once believed love was unbreakable. Now, I know better. Love breaks. And sometimes, in the quiet that follows, you find the version of yourself you were never brave enough to meet.